morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Andy McClelland from Numerix. I work in Quantitative Research and Development. Can we just get the timer on the clock going, just so I know where I am? Okay. In today's presentation, I'll be discussing getting risk models and pricing models to play nice. And the context, the use case, will be projecting exposures and margin requirements. You can probably guess what I mean by pricing models and risk models. Pricing models, things like Black-Scholes, Hull-White. Risk models are going to be things like GARCH or PCA, or you just have the risk department sending over scenarios for vol surfaces. That's pretty straightforward, but what do I mean by playing nice? Well, we know that when we're working with pricing models, we have these fantastic techniques available to us. Least squares Monte Carlo. When we're computing CVA, the credit valuation adjustment, we can evolve the value of a complex derivative forward along those pricing model scenarios efficiently. Least squares Monte Carlo, regression style techniques. Least squares Monte Carlo has all manner of related associated techniques and advanced modern extensions which draw from the machine learning toolkit. So it's a great technique, great set of tools available when we're working with pricing models. But what about when we're working with risk models? What about when our scenarios come from a dedicated risk model? Well, the major hurdle that we're going to run into is that risk scenarios need to be translated into pricing models. A volatility surface needs to be calibrated into a Hester model, into Hester model parameters. That's going to be expensive. That's a calibration problem. As we'll see, the more complex, or sorry, the simpler that the translation is, the more we're going to be able to reach into that bag of least squares Monte Carlo tricks and benefit from it. The more complex that translation step is, the more creative we're going to need to be. All right, so we have three sections in this presentation. The first is pricing models versus risk models, a deeper look at that. The second will be least squares Monte Carlo techniques for when we're working with pricing models specifically. And I'm going to include in this the case where we have a pricing model dynamics. We have both the pricing measure dynamics, and we have the physical measure dynamics. I'm going to include that case in here. Least squares Monte Carlo techniques are available to us when we're in that setting. And the third section is how do we extend this stuff to the case where we're working with a risk model, a genuine risk model generating risk scenarios. All right, so into pricing models versus risk models. First, what do we use pricing models for? Well, of course, pricing derivatives, valuing derivatives, computing sensitivities for hedging of derivatives. Examples abound. We all know them, textbook examples. We have things like the Black-Scholes model, Hester model, Dupre model for equity and FX. In rates, we have Hull-White, Cox-Ross, and Chayet, and so on. They're typically written down under the continuous, they typically have continuous time dynamics. We write them down with continuous time dynamics. And they have both physical measure dynamics and they have pricing measure dynamics as well. We typically work, of course, under the pricing measure when we want to price things, but when we can, in fact, work with the physical measure to calculate risk, to measure risk. We can work with the physical measure. We can certainly do that. We can. But for today's purposes, well, you can, if you saw Sokkel's presentation, Sasha Sokkel's presentation yesterday, he was talking about a bit of this, and I'll touch on some of what he talked about a little later on. You'll be able to see we can calibrate the premia from historical data, from bond premia, from equity premia, and so on. And we can use that. We can build a physical measure model, and we can use that to generate risk scenarios. Of course, we can. But I'm not going to include that. I'm not going to, for today's purposes, I'm not going to consider that a dedicated, genuine risk model. Okay, and we'll see why in just a minute. Because we don't pick pricing models for their ability to produce good risk scenarios. Right? We pick pricing models for their ability, their ease of use in pricing and hedging derivatives, the ease of their tractability, ease of calibration, and things like that. We don't judge them on their ability to generate risk scenarios. Risk models, on the other hand, that's the primary purpose. They're there to measure risk for capital purposes, for risk limits and everything else. We judge risk models based on their ability to reproduce the relevant, the salient features of the historical data. That's what we work on risk models for. Risk models, examples, GARCH, PCA, Diebold-Lee, like dynamic Nelson-Siegel, big systems of things with macro factors and firm characteristics, sectors, regions, and all these sorts of things for these big, large sort of, you might call them hierarchical models. Or you just have prescribed scenarios. In the insurance world, one of the big insurance bodies, I think it's the Academy of Actuaries, American Academy of Actuaries, has a prescribed model for their economic scenario generator. It's just a prescribed model. They have the model, they have the parameters, and you use that to generate risk scenarios. Okay, it's often written down in discrete time, and it's just one measure. Right? We don't think about the pricing measure. We just think about the data generating process, the DGP, just the plain old dynamics. And we have, one interesting quirk of this is that they generate, you can write down your dynamics, exogenous dynamics for derived pricing quantities, like vol surfaces and curves, so that you can model vol surfaces directly. You don't have to do it from a structural model and work out what the vols are. We kind of have that as well in the pricing model, right? We have HAM that generates curves exogenously. We have Bergoni, variance swaps, variance curves exogenously. But here we're going to see this is a little bit more different. Okay, so pricing models and risk models. Applications. I think you probably guess, I probably already alluded to them, and most of you probably work in this area or a related area. The first would be we just want to measure the risk of our portfolio through time along realistic scenarios. So examples would be computing real-world PFE or EEPE, etc., for counterparty credit risk capital and risk limits in a bank. That's a standard use case. Second would be we want to project future sensitivities along realistic scenarios. This would be for liquidity management. We want to project our initial margin requirements. Initial margins are, in some cases, just like for SIM, you're just computing sensitivities and you're wrapping them up in parameters. But even for clearinghouse margin, clearinghouse margin, you can, it's a VAR, it's not a sensitivity-based calculation, but you can approximate it using sensitivities. Obviously, that's what SIM's getting at. So you can use those sensitivities, and you can project market risk capital, VAR, numbers like that. If you have sensitivities. Along your scenarios, you have sensitivities. You can project out what the margin's going to be, what the VAR is going to be, et cetera, for capital margin requirements. Obvious examples, liquidity management. We do MVA as an example where we would use that on pricing models. But, I also just want to have profiles. I want to have a distribution. Tell me how bad it could get, how much margin I could need, how much liquidity I could need over some horizon. Realistically, not off a pricing model, off a risk model. All right, and another one, a great example comes to us, and a lot of this actually comes from friends and colleagues and former colleagues who work in the insurance space, variable annuities. So they have this incredible, really nice use case. Their reserves, their capital reserves for a big block of variable annuities is based on the post-hedged P&L after some horizon, after some risk horizon. So what that means is you have risk scenarios, and then you actually value and hedge the portfolio, the block of variable annuities, along those scenarios out through time, take a centile, and that's your number. So here's another example where you need to be able to get your exposures, your values, your sensitivities out into the future. For your hedge ratios, obviously you need sensitivities. All right, so let's take a look with some diagrams. I'm going to set up these diagrams. I'm going to rely heavily on these diagrams. I'll start with a couple of risk scenarios. Here I've got 3 risk scenarios, blue line. I'm being very, very abstract about what a risk scenario is. We're not going to get into details. It could be a state, could be a curve, could be curves, could be vol surfaces, could be more. So it could be parameters. So we're just talking about these are just 3 simple risk scenarios over some observation horizons. We want to revalue the portfolio on specified horizons, okay? We're going to need to value our portfolio here, 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 and so on. We're going to need to value it there. Let's pick a location. Let's focus on these guys. We want to compute those values. What can we do? Of course, we have good old brute force Monte Carlo, or Monte Carlo squared. We literally just take our risk scenario, translate the risk scenario into a pricing model, and then generate pricing scenarios from that. We spawn pricing scenarios off that. That's Monte Carlo on Monte Carlo. That's expensive. That's an expensive calculation, typically viewed as an expensive calculation. Your values would be, you'd get your cash flows on those piles, and then you'd sum and discount them, and you'd get your value. Small surplus for cash flows, big surplus for values, because values are just expected sums of cash flows. Okay, so we want to avoid that. Least squares Monte Carlo is going to let us avoid that. We know least squares Monte Carlo will let us avoid that in a pricing setting, right? in XVA, for example. What about when we're working with risk models, risk scenarios? What if these aren't usually least squares Monte Carlo? You have a state, you just basically feed that into another state, off you go. It's just standard. You're projecting back on other states. What if you go translate between some risk scenario into a pricing model or a pricing model state or something like that? That'll become clearer in just a moment. It's an absolutely standard use case. What if the risk scenario is vol surface? You go turn that into a Hester model in order to price. That's where I'm going with that. Okay, so we'll come back to least squares Monte Carlo and how it works in just a moment. But let me just a little bit more groundwork to be done. This is a really simple way of looking at a static PFE calculation. I know it gets more complicated than that, or it could be easier than that depending on what you're doing, but I know it can get a lot more complicated than that. But let's say, for example, let's just keep it simple. We've got some risk model calibrated to historical data, historical correlations and vols and everything else. It produces risk scenarios. So it's going to produce a big set of risk scenario paths. Each risk scenario path is going to be turned into a pricing model. So you're going to have this partial calibration for each of those scenarios. You're going to turn it into a pricing model. Okay? You've got your pricing model along all those paths. You're going to take your positions, put them in. That's going to give you your exposures. That goes downstream, gets processed into useful risk metrics. Okay. Now, the reason I have this up here is just to draw your attention to this. It's not always so simple, right? Here's a really standard use case. Somebody has calibrated a risk-neutral pricing model, pricing measure, whole white two-factor model, for example. They've calibrated it. And they say, look, your job is just to say, okay, I'm going to give you scenarios from somewhere. I'm just going to send you over curves. I've got some curve generator. I'm going to send you over curves. Your job is to take those curves and just feed them in, read them in to a whole white two-factor with the parameters you've calibrated from the live data, just like you would always calibrate a whole white two-factor model. And your job is to then revalue the derivatives off those whole white two-factor models. Okay, so that's the intermediate case. Here, the parameters would be coming from live data, a live calibration, but the curves will be coming from some curve generator, some risk model somewhere else. We'll come back to an example of that later on. That's another important use case. Right? That's a simple one, but it's another important use case. Even that one, just think about that one. What do? You've got a whole lot two-factor here with parameters, with vols, reversions, correlation. Curves are coming from here. We're going to have to think about, okay, so you've got these curves coming in. How are we going to apply least squares Monte Carlo when we've got curves coming from one kind of model and we're feeding them into another model for pricing purposes? That's the kind of problem that we're looking at today. It's a standard problem. It's an absolutely standard problem. All right, one last thing on pricing models versus risk models before we jump into LSMC. What do we get when we move from a pricing model to a risk model? Well, we get a bit of it. Some of it overlaps with what we would get if we went from a pricing measure to a pricing model under the physical measure, right? You start throwing in premia, you move to the physical drifts and physical jump probabilities and physical whatever. That's going to change things. So you're going to get equity vol premia. It's going to move your equity scenarios. Depending on your loadings onto equity, that's going to ramp your exposures up or it's going to ramp them down. Same thing for vols, same thing for commodities, same things for interest rates. You control the slope of the curve, long run slope of the curve by bond premium, right? So that's part of what you're going to get from working with a physical measure dynamics for a pricing model. We want all of that stuff. That stuff's great. But it's hard because calibrating those premiums is not so straightforward. It really isn't straightforward. And Sasha talked about this a bit yesterday. It's not easy to calibrate those sorts of parameters. Look at the models that we use, right? They're all latent factor models. You're calibrating parameters from a bunch of potentially not so high dimensional, but whole lot two-factor. You've got two latent state variables. You know what I mean? Like it's not entirely trivial. It's at least a filtering problem. It's not entirely straightforward. I guess you can use moments and all that, but in general, Heston, Bayes, all that sort of stuff. It's going to get complicated pretty quickly, right?
Sorry, Henry.
Please.
Just to make it clear. So what you want to do is to derive the dynamics, for example, of the implied vol that comes from the actual risk scenarios. Did I get it right? I
want to price off that. So I'm not really interested in the dynamics. I'm hoping that somebody gives me the dynamics.
Well, yeah. I mean, you do have the risk scenarios.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
So now, if you calibrate based on the risk scenarios, if I understand correctly, what effectively you get is the dynamic of the implied vol that come from sort of the underlying risk scenarios. Because you do calibrate based on the risk scenario. I mean, you will need to do it somehow. Yeah. And this I guess what you're going to explain us, right? But ultimately, you will end up having a dynamic on the implied vol that is sort of implied from the risk scenarios. Did I get it right?
Close. I'm actually going to close. I'll come back to it when I get there from Vizia. I'll come back and we will have time. I'm sure we'll have time. Yeah, definitely. I see where you're going with that, though. Absolutely. That's exactly. I definitely see where you're going with that, though. It's very close to that. Yeah. So the first thing I'm saying is, say for example, that's what I'm getting at is why not just use pricing models, Heston models, Bayes models, real-world variants of that, physical measure variants of those. Why not just use those for risk purposes, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at here. It's hard because there's a bunch of. If you want to use a serious one, if you want to use like a two-factor Heston, a three-factor Cheyenne or something like that, that stuff gets complicated. They're big filtering problems. They can be expensive filtering problems. In general, they're hard problems. We can use risk models which write all this stuff down exogenously. It's much, much more straightforward. Risk models will give us all of this, it will introduce all of these features, and it will be, it would be much more straightforward to calibration. They're more flexible, we don't care about tractability for pricing things and everything else. So in general, it's easier. That being said, I wanted to make this clear. Joining risk models and pricing models can lead to sort of things that you don't really want, right? So if you think about a risk model and a pricing model, the second the volatilities don't agree, the second the pricing model vol doesn't agree with the risk model, the volatility of the risk scenarios, you've got arbitrage opportunities. That's just textbook stuff, right? If you take a Black-Scholes physical measure with one vol and you're pricing off a Black-Scholes with another vol, arbitrage. And I think it's even worse. When you're simulating things like vol surfaces directly, the vol in the vol surface might not agree with the vol in your underlying series, right? So you can lead to sort of absurdities there as well. There are two ways you can respond to that. You can say one way, which I'm kind of getting at, I don't care. We're not pricing off these things. I'm not training a trading strategy off these things. I'm using them to measure risks. I don't care if there's a little bit of arbitrage opportunities here or there. I'm not looking to exploit that. I'm willing to accept it. I'm willing to accept a little bit of arbitrage for more flexibility in my risk model. Or you could say, no, I insist. I want to have a good physical measure model to do all this. And I was in this camp for a long, long time. As I explained, I came from this. I was in econometrics. As a student, I did econometrics, working on exactly that kind of problem, calibrating like extended Bates models with more factors from big histories of option pricing data using filtering techniques, Markov chain Monte Carlo techniques, and all the rest of it. So it's a great way of doing it. If anyone's here, please.
Okay, you're using the term risk model.
Yeah.
To be very clear about that, are you talking about risk pricing models, or are you talking about the model which is then taking the evaluation of the scenarios and translates them into...
No, I mean the one that's generating the scenarios. The model is generating the scenarios. So I could for example...
But we have a regulation now, at least on the market side, which makes it a condition for having internal models that...
Yeah, I should be clear. Thinking counterparty credit risk. Definitely thinking counterparty credit risk. Where, at least as far as I'm aware, counterparty credit risk, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, counterparty credit risk teams definitely have control, they have influence over, Does that answer the question for now? Okay. All right, so I'll keep going. You can calibrate pricing models, like real-world Bates, real-world Heston, real-world all that. You can calibrate those to historical data. It's all doable, but it's hard. There's a huge econometric literature, and there's also some great work in like the quant finance world as well. Hull, Sokol & White, Barker, Dickinson, and Lipton, and Konnikov, a former colleague of mine, Mark Konnikov, estimating physical measure parameters for these pricing models. I would just say that again, this is kind of future work. Right now, this isn't really feasible. Not today. The models are still they're not quite as flexible as you would need them to be to work in risk. All right, so I've got to keep moving. I've got to try and get moving. Least squares Monte Carlo. I'm sure that many of us are familiar with least squares Monte Carlo. It's adapted from Longstaff Schwartz and Carrier and others who are working on pricing early exercise instruments. So you can see Cesari or Antonov et al. For early work in the counterparty credit risk and XVA setting. All right, at early days, it was all pricing measure and it was just for exposures. You were just working with exposures. The basic idea is that, well, we can write down our values, conditional expectation of future cash flows, right? I'm going to ignore discounting and contract features and all that sort of stuff, just a simple conditional expectation. That's going to give us some function of the state, Markov system, function of the state and time, and implicit dependence on the parameters, okay? Let's go back to our diagrams. What does that look like? Well, we're trying to compute XVA. We're going to now have our risk scenario, we're going to have our XVA scenarios, which are coming off our pricing model, so in orange. We want to value our portfolio along those scenarios. We could use brute force Monte Carlos, born many paths from each of those outer scenarios, each of those XVA scenarios. That would be very, very expensive. XVA. Risk versus Monte Carlo basically says, no. You've already got many, many paths, right? I'm trying to approximate this function. You've got many, many paths. I can use them in a cohesive way. I can use them together to fit an approximation for this function, right? I've got many, many paths. I've got a lot of information. I've got thousands of XVA scenarios. I can fit that function by regression style techniques. Obviously, nowadays, much more advanced techniques. So you can see which Hughes and Savine are doing, or Antonov and Peterberg are doing. There's much more to it than that. Today's presentation isn't about all the different variations on least squares Monte Carlo. It's more about how we line it up with risk models. Okay, so least squares Monte Carlo is going to say, hey, you could just use your XVA scenarios, take your cash flows along them, hey, and project them back. It's a simple regression. Project those cash flows back onto the conditioning states. You've got your function, you've got your values, and you're good to go. And of course, I tell a bit of a lie. You don't have to use just those XVA scenarios to generate those regression functions. Of course, in practice, you might only need 5,000 pars for an XVA calculation. But what if you have a really complex deal that requires like 50,000 pars to get a good fit for a reliable fit for the regression function? So you would have two sets of pars, and this is important for later on. You basically have a set of fitting scenarios, pricing model pars. Well, what matters is that it's pricing model after the conditioning date. That's what's really going to matter, okay? So you'll use 50,000 pars to build the regression functions, store regression functions, then you come back and you evaluate those regression functions on your XVA pars. So that's all fairly straightforward. We're going to do something similar in just a moment with our physical measure model. Okay, so now moving forward, some of the extensions of least squares Monte Carlo. All of the new what algorithm differentiation tools and the availability of them has done for us on least squares Monte Carlo. Obviously, Huge and Savine, they're using sensitivities as regularizers, boosting the fit, improving the fit for a fixed set of pars, and getting big speed up, big improvement in fit and fitting performance, and they're actually getting nice deltas out of it, nice sensitivities out of it. Ricali seems to have some theoretical results for why this works so well. Lee's doing something similar with control variates off the pathway sensitivities as well. For us today, the big benefit of having AD is that it allows you to produce those forward sensitivities efficiently, really, really quickly. So the way that works is for things like MBA. The way that would work is you take you've got your equation for your value. If I differentiate this thing, it's really simple. I just differentiate with respect to x, the state variables, differentiate the expectation. I'm just differentiating that function. So if I have a means for building this function, and that function, the implementation of that function, has algorithm differentiation cooked into it, I can simply just differentiate through the regressions. Differentiate through it, and I have my deltas and my whatever. I have my first order sensitivities. One other approach to doing that, which I'm going to mention, the way I probably prefer to do it nowadays, is another way we looked at with Alexander. You can actually just take obviously you can take the derivative operator inside the expectation, and you'll get a new function. This is going to be a bit more expensive, of course, because for each state you're going to have a new regression function. But for me, I just can't get over the fact that I would much prefer that I can have a dedicated function for each of the sensitivities. If you really care about the quality of the sensitivity, I think this is definitely the way you have to go. But again, we don't have to really take sides today. All right, so how would it work? We've seen that we can push out our cash flows and project them back. Now we will just be projecting out our cash flow sensitivities, triangles, little triangles, cash flow sensitivities, projecting them back for big triangles, which would be our value sensitivities. That's also pretty straightforward. Okay, so we know how least squares Monte Carlo works for values and sensitivities. Now let's try and get them to work for risk model scenarios. First, a little detour, we'll do it for pricing measure dynamics of the risk models. Again, I should be clear, Hester model with some equity premium and vol premium would be a physical measure specification for a pricing model. Okay, some of the early approaches to doing this were as follows. What you could do is you could say, okay, I can extend to my physical dynamics. Say, for example, for Black-Scholes, you're just going to introduce an equity premium or whatever. And we're going to look at this expression. We're going to say, okay, we know it's a conditional pricing measure expectation. That's just the conditional physical expectation with a change in measure process baked into it. We take that change in measure process, we end up with this. Basically just weighted cash flows. We're in basically exactly the same situation. We have exactly the same setup that we had a moment ago. It's some function, but now we're working under the physical measure, and we're basically just weighting our cash flows by change measure process. Nice and simple. So Alexander did that, I was doing that. This is actually how I started working at Numerix many years ago with Alexander. They were doing something similar, but they were looking at it in terms of, this equation. This looks like mapping from one exchange, one currency into another currency, right? It looks like you're just, adjusting the currency of cash flows. So they had a great idea to reuse your multi-currency implementation just to trick it into doing adjusted pricing measures stuff. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. What would that look like with our diagrams? Well, we're back to our risk scenarios. Risk scenarios here. We want our values here. Well, we're not going to produce pricing measure pars. We're not going to do that. We're just going to use our physical measure. Physical measure pars. We're going to take our cash flows. We're going to weight them by our change in measure process, and then we're just going to run our regressions back. Absolutely straightforward. So one set of pars not expensive. Avoiding brute force Monte Carlo, you're just projecting weighted cash flows back. They'll give you a risk-neutral expectation here as long as you've weighted by the change of measure. All right, moving forward, another way of doing this is along the lines of Stein and Feng et al. These guys do a lot of great work in this area. And Antonov et al., the work we did a few years ago. The idea would be you're building those regression functions, just reevaluate those regression functions. Build your regression functions as per usual using pricing measure paths, and then just evaluate those regressions off paths simulated off the physical measure model. So you've got two steps. First, you would build a build step. You would have risk-neutral pricing measure dynamics. That would create states that you would use to build the regression functions, freeze the regression functions, lock them. Then you would simulate the evaluation paths of the physical measure. You would use those to evaluate the regression functions. That would tell you, how the value is evolving along those physical measure trajectories. That would give you physical measure risk. What would that look like? Well, as you saw earlier, you've got your paths, you build your regression functions, then you show up with your physical measure paths, and you've got your regression function here, you just evaluate them there. Pretty straightforward. You run into some problems, of course, because physical measure goes from here to here as you start to throw in equity premium and things like that. And it gets much, much worse in multiple dimensions. One possibility is to use the techniques of, the suggestion of Green and Kenyon. So what they'll do is they'll say, no, well, this is great, but you can also, who cares? You can actually add some noise to your initial states. That's going to give you some additional spread in the scenarios as you move further out. Now, hopefully, that your physical measure scenarios are more within the domain that's been simulated for your regression functions, covered by the regression functions, sure.
Sorry, did I get it right? That anyhow, you're implicitly assuming that the functional form of your physical measure model is somewhere in the vicinity of the...
Here I'm assuming that they're exactly the same. Sorry for this, I should have... Here, up to this point, I'm assuming they're exactly the same. But we're going to break that soon. So these techniques are really easy when you're going from a physical Heston to a risk-neutral Heston. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah,
exactly. So thank you. That's exactly the point. These techniques are super easy to extend when you've got a physical model and a risk model and a pricing model, which are the same model, just under different dynamics. Super easy to extend.
If you have a very different distribution, the risk-neutral and real world, for example, Turkish lira, callable cross-currency. So you deal with it by just taking different...
No, I don't think this is going to work. This won't be good enough. The technique, we're going to get to it. This won't be good enough. Just trying to extend you're never going to get away around this extrapolation problem like this. No, it's not going to work. Okay, so let me go. Last one on physical stuff. This is going to help us get underway. Now what you can do is you can just say, hey, I'm going to generate my risk scenarios, my physical measure scenarios, and then from each of those, I'm just going to spawn one pricing measure path, just like we do in least squares Monte Carlo, and then I'm just going to project them back directly. So let's just look at what that might look like. I'll make it clear. So let's get serious about the expectations. Expectation of time t, let's actually fix a time. Okay, so we're conditioning on x of t, fix a time. We actually want values at t bar. Okay, t bar is going to be useful. What that means is we're going to have outer scenarios. These are going to be physical measure scenarios we're going to use, and then we're going to have inner scenarios, I, to spawn the pricing measure state. So it'll be clear in the scenario. I just want to mention to you though, the idea is that you're spawning, you start your outer scenarios at some location x naught, but your inner scenarios, you're using the outer model to seed the inner model, states. Okay, so what would it look like? Well, we're basically doing the same thing in the brute force case, right? Risk scenario into pricing states really, and then you simulate forward. But the idea here would be you'd only use one. I don't need to do brute force. I can just use exactly the same principle as least squares Monte Carlo. Just continue those paths forward, but under the pricing measure dynamics. Run a regression, and you're good to go. So you're avoiding that Monte Carlo. It's just one regression. What I will say is that it's a bit more expensive. But the computers are getting so good, I don't care as much anymore. I'm happy to spend a bit more time if I can get really robust, accurate numbers. So here the problem is you have to do this for every time step. So you have to do this for that time step. You have to simulate another set of pricing measure paths. That time step, another set of pricing measure paths. So you do have something of order, number of time steps, but there are other ways of getting around that, better interpolation schemes and everything else. But it's just my personal opinion. I don't really care so much anymore. Okay. All right, I'm going to leave this. I'll come back to that if I get time. This is my preferred approach. It's using kernels, and It's a bit slower than usual, but it's extremely robust, and you can't get yourself into too much trouble. So I'm going to leave that, and because I want to get to this. This is the important bit, okay? All right, so now we've got those techniques. The last one, spawning, you simulate off your risk model, spawn your pricing model stuff, and then you project back. You run a regression back, or you could use a kernel or whatever. You project back. How are we going to adapt that to the case where we're working with scenarios no longer coming? You don't have a real-world Heston going into a pricing measure Heston. You're not just dropping risk premium anymore. You're coming from potentially, as we'll see, vol surfaces, and they have to go into a Heston or into an LV or something like that. Okay, so let's start simple though. Let's start really, really simple. Let's start from where we were just a moment ago. Let's say we have whole whites. Let's say we have a pricing measure, a physical measure whole white for the outer scenarios, physical measure whole white for the outer scenarios, and a pricing measure whole white, two-factor, for the inner scenarios, okay? We've got these two models. What we just saw a moment ago was that if these two models are consistent, same vols and everything else, the only way that they differ is in this, what happened? Oh yeah, there's some correlations. Okay, sorry. You've got some risk premium. You've got some risk premium embedded in this. That's the only difference. All you've done is you've introduced risk premium, bond premium, to move from pricing measure from pricing measure to physical measure. This is absolutely fine. What you have here, you've got the dynamics for the forward curve, and you have a forward curve equation, right? So you can compute your forwards from your straights. This is just your forward curve reprojection formula. It's standard. Your forward is equal to the initial forward plus the states. You can see those two formulas are exactly the same. The parameters are exactly the same. The convexity is going to be exactly the same. They're exactly the same. If you take the two states of your physical measure model down here and you stick them in to the pricing measure forward equation, you're going to get exactly the same forwards, okay? Now, what happens if we have something like this where we change the parameters? Now they're not compatible anymore. What's going to happen? Well, you can't do that trick anymore, okay? So just take a look at this. If we look at this forward, this is the equation for the forward curve. You've got different parameters. If I take my x1 and x2 of my physical measure model, well, if I stick them into this equation, I'm going to get one set of forward curves. If I stick them into this equation, there are different parameters. I'm going to get different forward curves. So this doesn't make sense anymore, right? What's going to happen is, hey, I want to value my derivatives off the markets coming from this model. Well, if you take those and you stick them in there, you're not even going to reproduce the forwards. So you're not pricing off that market at all. You're pricing off a different market. I don't know, you're not really pricing off anything meaningful, right? The way around it, one way to deal with it would be to say, okay, I can't get these to line up anymore. My forward curves, different parameters so they don't line up. But maybe if I have my outer scenarios, I can best fit for my inner scenarios. I can try and pick the two states that are most in line with the curves coming from the risk model. I guess that's one way of doing it, but here's a better way of doing it, I think. Yeah, you can't do this. You can't seed the inner model from these states anymore. It's just not going to work. Let's say, for example, the risk department is sending over forward curves, and we're going to say, okay, if you do that, I'm going to take those forward curves, and along each path, I'm going to take the forward curve you give me, and I'm going to stick it into my pricing measure model. I'm going to feed it into here. Okay, so no longer do I have the initial forward curve here. So the way to start this curve is from the initial forward curve. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to now take the forward curve coming off here at some time t bar, and I'm going to stick it in there as the initial forward curve, and I'm going to set the states to 0. So basically, what I'm doing here is that I'm literally just, if you give me a forward curve, I'm going to set the whole white states to 0. And I'm basically building a new whole white model as you would any other day of the week. That's all I'm doing. So the forward curve is now coming from the outer model. The forward curve is coming from here. But what's that going to do for us? That's not going to happen. How does that work, right? Least squares Monte Carlo, we usually think about states. The states are locked at 0. Like, what are we going to condition on? What's changing from one scenario to another? The only thing changing from one scenario to another is this. It's a curve. It's a curve. I mean, it's a big high-dimensional thing, right? So how am I going to, it's this guy. How am I going to use that? How am I going to use that in a regression setting? What am I going to project onto it? Do I want to be projecting onto a big, huge, how many tenors? Like 20 tenors? I don't want to be doing that. I want to get it to a low number of dimensions. Okay, if only there was a low-dimensional representation of the curves that we're feeding in. And of course, there is. These forwards are just coming from here. So if the risk department is sending you over forwards, just forward curves directly. If they're just sending over forward curves, you say, no. You give me the states and the parameters where that forward curve came from, because that gives me a low-dimensional representation for that thing. Okay, is that kind of clear? Does that sort of make a bit of sense? You have the risk model states end up being pushed through into something you can condition on for the pricing model scenarios. The risk model states end up becoming available. They're present in the pricing models used for all of those scenarios. They're there. And they're low-dimensional, and you can use them for projecting onto it. We can extend this. I won't spend too much time on it right now. I've got to keep moving. But you can do the same thing. Sure.
Just that again. So what you're really leveraging, if you understand correctly, is that when you are in simulation, your forwards are generated from a low dimension.
Exactly.
And so you sort of use that
exactly
to push the regression.
Exactly. And I should emphasize those states could be coming from. I'm using a whole lot for simplicity. They could be coming from a Diebold Lie. They could be coming from a 4-factor. And they could be coming from a 4-factor or a 5-factor. Who cares? But those factors are going to show up in here, and that's what you're going to condition on, project onto. And this will work. This will absolutely work. All right, you can do the same thing with local vols. Right? If I'm simulating vol surfaces using a local vol model, that's pretty straightforward. Like that's something people do. I know people who do that. They'll simulate log local vols. They'll simulate those into the futures. They'll use those local vols to produce an implied vol surface. They'll use that implied vol surface to price vanillas. But what are we going to price our exotics off? Well, let's say, for example, if you're allowed to use a local vol model, that'll be perfect, right? Because you've got this thing, they're simulating a local vol surface for you. We would say, okay, don't just send me over the full local vol surface. Don't send me that whole thing over. I need to project onto something. If you give me a different local vol surface per scenario, that's a massive high dimensional thing I need to project onto. Give me the decomposition. Give me the thing you use to produce those local vols. If you give me that, I can stick that in here and I can condition on it. It's low dimensional. All right, so now let's change that a little bit. Let's say, 2 minutes. We're not using the Dupre model. We want a Hester model. For whatever reason, we say, no. For this deal, we need a Hester model. We need stochastic vol for that. You need a Hester model. You can't do that. You can't use a Dupre. Now we've got a problem. Those outer states, the local vol, you can't just stick that into the inner model local vol function. You can't do that. You need to calibrate it into a set of Heston parameters, the reversion, the vol, etc. Where does that leave us? How are we going to push these? We have a low-dimensional representation of this thing. That's going to feed into something you would imagine low-dimensional. But how do we get that mapping? How are we going to retain? How are we going to find that low-dimensional relation that we can project onto? Well, let's have a think about what we can use. There's this new, again, another really just a great idea from Hernandez and Bayer and Horvath and everybody else, this notion of deep calibration. Deep calibration, and in this context, I'll talk about deep calibration by learning the inverse map. All right, so what does that mean? Let's look at our problem. We've got a model, we've got something general state space for generating risk scenarios. This thing, the states go wherever, and it's going to produce, this is it. These are the states of our risk model. Those things are going to map into vol surfaces somehow. However they're going to do it, they're going to map into vol surfaces. It's going to be a lower dimensional space though, because this is low dimensional. There's no way that's going to span the full space of vol surfaces. There's no way. That's way too high dimensional. From those market vols, we're going to calibrate into Heston parameters. Again, because that's low dimensional, that's low dimensional, that's low dimensional as well. That's also low dimensional. So we have all these low dimensional, probably nonlinear embeddings, manifolds, stuck in these larger spaces. Now, the idea of deep calibration, and I'll finish on this, what they're doing is they'll say, hey, I'll simulate a bunch of Heston parameters from the full space of potential Heston parameters. I'll build the implied vol surfaces, and then I'll learn the inverse map. I've got a training set. Parameters, vol surfaces, I'll learn the inverse map. There's a little bit of debate about how effective it is. There's a little bit of debate about how effective that is, but let's assume it is effective. If it's going to be effective, it's definitely going to be effective in our case, right? They're trying to learn the map for the entire potential range of vol surfaces. They're using this for like pricing. They're using this for serious front office pricing. We're not. We've got these low dimensional spaces. We only need to learn a mapping between low dimensional subspaces of these two spaces of interest, right? They're embedded. They're much lower dimension than the full space. So if it's going to work, we've got a much easier job. And there's a lot of work on manifold learning, et cetera, that would allow us to do that. I haven't done it. To be honest with you, I probably don't want to do it myself. There are people better than me at doing it, but I want to, frame the problem up for them and hand them over. Maybe Alexander could take that one. All right, so do I have any time for questions, or am I?
Maybe just one question.
One? Okay, I'll be around for lunch anyway, so thank you very much.